The Flower Class Corvette, the little ship that could. The Flower Class Corvette was a determined little submarine hunter of the Second World War, originally designed to serve as a stopgap measure until more powerful destroyer escorts could be produced in larger numbers. However, the small ship would end up serving a whole range of duties the world over, and became an indispensable resource to the Western approach's command, and almost all of the Allied navies. The little ship would even see modifications to serve in military and civilian roles in the post-war period. During the First World War, submarines of the day had been soundly defeated by the Royal Navy and the French Navy. The invention of such technologies such as sonar and changes in naval tactics, such as convoys, had seen submarines ended as a threat for the period. In the interwar period, submarines were seen as a novelty of the Great War, made obsolete by changes in technology. U-boats of the interwar period were so undervalued that a resurgent Germany didn't even fully utilise its available submarine tonnage, preferring to allocate it to surface warships. The Royal Navy was similarly dismissive of the value of submarines, trusting its escort fleet and technologies such as sonar would be more than enough to defeat the submarines a second time around. In early 1939, before the outbreak of the war, the Royal Navy finally recognised the threat a submarine fleet would pose, and that it lacked the escorts to properly fight a battle in the Atlantic. The Flower Class Corvette was designed to fill the role that was required for it. A relatively cheap ship with the range of transatlantic travel, Britain's shipyards at the time were all taken up by military vessels for the naval rearmament, so the Flower Class Corvette would need to be produced at civilian shipyards. The result was a small ship, mostly using leftover components and civilian ship components, which could easily be produced the empire over at a relatively low cost. The main drawbacks, however, were the very slow top speed of the Corvette, only 16 knots. Its ballast was also slightly imbalanced, meaning it was easily thrown around in the stormy Atlantic. The low speed and bad stability did, however, give it the greatest turning radius of any ship in the Allied navies, able to outmaneuver German U-boats. The Flower Class Corvette was designed for one thing and one thing only: anti-submarine warfare, and the weapon complement reflects this. Armed with just a single deck gun, sorry I changed too quickly then, and a single AA gun and a pair of interchangeable secondaries, normally pom-pom guns, for surface warfare, the Flower Class had the bare minimum amount of weapons. Its real armament was the Aztec sonar, radar and depth charge rails used for U-boat hunting. Later ships would also be fitted with Hedgehog mortars. The size of the vessel and the readily available merchant components used in its construction meant that a single Flower Class took less than a year to be produced from its keel to its commission. The UK, France and Canada all put down many orders for Flower Class Corvettes, with the first ones coming into service in the 40s. They would immediately undertake escort duties around the Atlantic and reduce the strain on the beleaguered Royal Navy. Canadian and Royal Navy corvettes would become an indispensable resource to Western Approach's command. Several were also transferred to other dominions such as South Africa, India and New Zealand. They would also be produced and transferred to several Allied navies, such as the Netherlands, in exile of course, the US and Norway. Several of them would also end up in German hands as they were captured under construction by the German Navy. They would serve, hence, in the Axis as well, in the Kriegsmarine. All in all, nearly 300 served in various navies during and after the war. The Flower Class, however, would go as an unrecognised warhorse, serving with distinction against the U-boat menace. Their crews would have to battle horrible conditions in the ships, which were often damaged more by the weather than the enemy. The Arctic convoys to the USSR in particular saw the crews of these vessels enduring horrible conditions in the snowstorms. having open decks and bridges. Some crewmen even reported their comrades freezing to death while on watch. During the conditions in the Arctic, Flower-class vessels and their crews developed a close camaraderie with their Soviet counterparts. Soviet command was forever grateful to the sailors of the Arctic convoys who escorted the vital Lend-Lease equipment to the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin himself would raise a toast and say, "Without the machines we received through the Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." In 2020, Colonel Elevik I hope I'm saying that right, of the Russian Navy would say, "The Allied seamen showed true heroism in their long and perilous sea passages, continuously attacked by enemy forces in the appalling weather conditions of the Arctic." Despite the importance of the theatre, however, and the horrible conditions endured by the crews, the sacrifices of the Flower-class vessels in the Arctic would remain unrecognised, it being the only theatre of the war not awarded a campaign star by Britain. It would take until 2012 for Prime Minister David Cameron to award all sailors of the Arctic convoys and their escorts the Arctic Star. The workhorse of the Arctic convoys still commanded such respect in Russia that Vladimir Putin later that year will present all British and Canadian sailors of the Arctic convoys the Russian Ushakov Medal. First and foremost among these crews, the Flower Class Corvettes that worked tirelessly to secure the war routes. In the modern day, the Flower Class is almost totally forgotten. The tired workhorse of the war, a horse which would continue to serve around the world in military and civilian roles for a further 40 years, until finally coming to a rest. Today, only the HMCS Sackville survives, sailing once a year in honour of the Battle of the Atlantic, the horse resting at last. Except, in 2020, digital scans of the HMCS Sackville will be made, and a digital version of the ship would fight one last battle in the Atlantic. Named Dickie, this corvette would fight in the 2020 movie Greyhound against U-boats one final time.